Good morning, everyone. I'm Maggie Webster, the Associate Director for External Affairs, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to your National Museum of American History, where we preserve and share national treasures to help visitors understand the past in order to make sense of the present and help shape a more humane future. Our philanthropy initiative was launched in 2015 with the support of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and David Rubenstein, and it connects directly to this mission by examining how philanthropy has helped to shape and reshape the nation. Our annual program, The Power of Giving, Philanthropy's Impact on American Life, and its accompanying exhibition, Giving in America, explore how Americans have mobilized resources to affect change in America. The Philanthropy Initiative continues to expand and grow with additional support from Fidelity Charitable Trustees Initiative, a grant-making program of Fidelity Charitable, who we'd like to thank for making today's program possible. It's really hard to think of a better person for this first Meet a Philanthropist conversation than Helen LaKelly Hunt. She's made history through her giving and appreciates how important and powerful it is to tell the inclusive stories of women's philanthropy. Helen has been a leader in the women's funding movement. She co-founded the New York Women's Foundation, the Dallas Women's Foundation, the Sister Fund, and the Women's Funding Network. She and her sister, Ambassador Swanee Hunt, established Women Moving Millions, a global network of donors who have made gifts of $1 million or more for the advancement of women and girls. Part of her efforts to catalyze that group involved writing a book about notable women givers, therefore writing them into history. Helen recognizes the importance of women flexing their financial muscle and elevating the stories of their doing so. She's also written about women who pioneered in their efforts to form a more humane nation. She has a doctorate in church history and recently published a book about an interracial group of feminist abolitionists in the 1830s and early 1840s. One of the women whose story she tells in And the Spirit Moved Them, the lost radical history of the first feminists, was Lucretia Mott. We were delighted to be able to put Lucretia Mott's shawl and bonnet on display for you to see out in the lobby. While you're here today, I hope you'll also take the opportunity to see the portrait of Eliza Hamilton on view in the Giving in America exhibition on our third floor. Eliza Hamilton helped found one of the earliest private orphanages in the United States and helped forge opportunities for women's public leadership in the early United States. Eliza Hamilton and Lucretia Mott helped shape the country in its early years. Helen is helping to reshape it today. She's been a leader in the women's movement for many years and is an inductee in the National Women's Hall of Fame. Please join me in welcoming Helen and the museum's David M. Rubenstein Curator of Philanthropy, Amanda Moniz.
It's such a pleasure to be able to sit down and talk with you. Not everybody knows, but several months ago I conducted an oral history with Helen, and this conversation builds on that conversation. Let me start by asking about how you learned about your wealth and became a philanthropist. Not everybody knows the story of how you discovered your financial power and how you became a philanthropist. You grew up comfortable, but you didn't appreciate how much wealth you had inherited. So could you tell that story, please?
Yes. So how's this sound? Raise your hand. Raise your hand if you can't hear well at the back. I grew up a daughter of H.L. Hunt, who discovered the East Texas oil field. And when other people ask me about what was growing up like, I say, what I'll say to you, has anyone ever seen the TV show Dallas? Would you raise your hands? Like J.R., Suella, anyone? You didn't see Dallas? You didn't see it? Okay. Well, those of you who saw that TV show, that was what it was like growing up for me. Dad had 3 families, and when the first Mrs. Hunt died, my mom and Swanee and my 2 siblings moved into the mansion, and Dad had set up a trust for us that was allowed anything in the trust, like the company stock, to go to his daughters and sons. But suddenly there was money, apparently for me, but no one told me about it until Swanee called me one day. And I was in my early 30s, and she said, "Helen." I said, "What?" She said, "Have you seen Forbes magazine?" I said, "Well, it's at the, it came in the mail, but but no, I haven't read it." "Well, we're mentioned in it." I said, "You're kidding." And she said, "Yeah. And do you know how much we're worth?" And I said, "No." And she told me what it said in Forbes magazine. And I just went, "Where is this money?" It was like 200 million. That's what Forbes said. And she said, "I don't know." And I said, "Well, we got to find the money." And she said, "I just don't know what to do." I said, "Well, I've read, Nancy Drew is my favorite author. Let's find the money." And that's how I learned about my wealth. And Swanee was just my guiding light and such an inspiration.
And could you talk a little bit then about how you grew into being a philanthropist?
Yes, so we found the money, and so in the, so Swanee was the heroine of the story. So we started talking and learned about distributions we were entitled to receive, and we took that money and began to do what we felt called to do.
So I know you were raised Baptist, and religion is so important in motivating your giving. Could you talk about how your faith, what it means to you, and how it shapes your philanthropy?
Yeah, because my faith so shapes it, I thought I would say more about my giving in this.
Sure.
3 things about my faith, being raised as a Christian. So I didn't have a relationship with my mom or my dad or really anyone in my family except Swanee. And she got me through life with a couple other things, but especially my faith. My faith was my salvation going through life. Second, there are 2 kinds of Christians. One are good at judging, and I think many for the right reasons. They judge well, in the best sense of the word many times. There's a second kind of being a Christian, which is you're just a follower of Christ. And Jesus Christ on earth, apparently, according to scriptures, walked with the marginalized. And that's what I felt called to do. My mother had put us at a Christian church, and I just felt, and I think Swanee and June, my other sister, we just all felt called to do what we could do for the marginalized. There's a verse, "To whom much is given, much is required." So this was not a casual thing for us. When you suddenly learn you have that much money, it's like, what do we do with this? Now, a last point I want to make is, speaking of the marginalized, well, are women really that marginalized? I mean, there are a lot of other, wealthy white women. I was in that class. There are so many other people who are so broken, low income, and then race, and there are other things. So why would a woman like me fund women? And I'll just say that there was a group of women who rose up in the 1830s that not too many people know about. And they rose up during the time of slavery, growing exponentially in the country. Every year there were more and more slaves. And I think the founding fathers thought there were slaves, but it's going to die out. So, it's a democracy, but of the 9 presidents, I think 7 were slave owners, and there was sort of a dissociation about what's really going on in the country with the growth of slavery. And these women rose up and said slavery should be abolished. You know, it's a sin. And I know I can't vote against slavery, and I'm not supposed, and my church says I can't speak out because women don't speak in public. But God's telling me I got to speak out against slavery. And so they rose up and broke the social taboo of speaking out. And they were ridiculed, slammed, just criticized. And one woman said, this is a cause worth dying for. It was so dangerous for them to speak out against slavery. And when the Emancipation Proclamation was finally achieved, these women had woken up to ways they were slaves. That they were citizens of the United States, and they paid their taxes, and they couldn't vote. They didn't have a voice. They couldn't speak in public. And these women suddenly wrote, okay, we freed those slaves. What about us? We need to be freed too. And that's when I just realized, well, it's not that women, but I was a part of a group going, we have to fund women. Like, that's the one thing I think is one of the most important things to do. Learn, you know, we have to fund women for this culture to get better.
So you've written that you were depressed that you had read that wealthy women didn't fund the women's suffrage movement and that you wanted to change this dynamic. Could you talk more about why that motivated you?
Yeah, this was really the galvanizing thing on my end that led to Women Moving Millions. I took time off as an activist, going back to school. And I thought, I want to read about the history of feminism because I was working in behalf of the women's rights movement and the history of women's suffrage. And I was reading letters and I was working on a dissertation. And I discovered a letter of Matilda Joslyn Gage writing Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And she had read in the paper that a wealthy woman had given $1 million to a museum. And her words were, in her letter to Stanton, "Is it not strange that women of wealth are constantly giving large sums of money to colleges and boys exclusively, to churches where they're not allowed to speak from the pulpit or speak. They have no voice, and yet they give no thought to funding their own sex, who are crushed in ignorance and poverty, and the hopeless victims of a social custom, and no one offers them a helping hand, and the whole world unites to help the boy and glorify the man." And that just broke my heart when I read that, because I didn't realize women hadn't even funded suffrage. 2 men funded suffrage. And there was one wealthy woman, but there was then a problem. The men in her family sued the estate, and the money that she wanted to go to suffrage didn't go as much. There was one woman in the decades, about 90 years, and 2 men funded suffrage. And those suffragettes, and there was no women of wealth stood beside them. And so that's when I also was growing aware that as I was working in women's foundations, as mentioned earlier, that a few women had given $1 million to women's funds. Abby Disney, Anne Delaney, some others. I began to try to count them, and I thought, these women are making history. My goodness, I'm going to write a book about these women, because didn't happen in the 19th century, and these women are writing history. So I went around and interviewed the women who'd made $1 million gifts, and that's when I got a call from Swanee. And Swanee said to me, "Helen, are you sitting down? I want to tell you something. And I said, what? And she said, well, I've been doing my will, and I've done it a couple years. There's something I haven't told you about it, but she said, would you like to know? And I said, yeah. She said, well, I left you in my will. I left you some money. I said, oh, Swanee, thank you. She said, I left you $5 million. I said, really? Me? Thank you. And she said, I want you to take this money and raise the bar of women's giving. I'm busy. I'm doing some other things. You can do it. I want you to do it. I said, oh, well, thank you very much. And she said, but there's a problem. I said, what? And she said, I think you're going to screw everything up. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, I think maybe you might die before me, and you'll ruin my plan. I said, okay, Swanee, what's your point? And she said, well, I want to give you the money now. Would you take this money and see if you can galvanize? I'm starting the Women in Public Policy at Harvard. I don't have time, but you take this and see what you can do with it. So I did my best, and that was catalyst. She was the catalyst of Women Moving Millions.
Seems like when the phone rings and it's Swanee, it's something. Yeah, really. So in 2005, then you started Women Moving Millions as a collective of women who each made $1 million gift for the advancement of women and girls. Could you talk about why it's important to you that there's a special community for these donors?
Oh, yes. Well, I'll just say that in starting, I thought, where's the best way to do this? And there were a community of women's foundations around the world. I had been a part of helping them grow in Swanee to grow and proliferate. That was a community. So I asked the Chris Grum, who is the head of the Women's Funding Network, to co-chair, and we created a Women Moving Millions campaign. And we started asking, I think our goal was 120 million. And so we did this by trying to create a community. And is there another quote where you're going to ask me about the Trailblazer book?
Yes,
Okay.
I'm going to ask you about Trailblazers.
So in this one, I'll just mention that, that for years I had gone to women saying, the Dallas Women's Foundation is trying to get started, or New York Women's Foundation, could you give $50,000? And they'd go, oh gosh, well I have to ask my husband, and but anyway, finally they would get, or 75 or maybe 100, that was huge, and they would say, okay, I talked with Larry, and he said, we can do 50. And I go, thank you so much. It was very bizarre when I would ask women to give $1 million, first time in the history, women of wealth are stepping up and unleashing their money. Would they unleash their money too? The women would tear up and they would thank me for asking them. And they'd go, oh, Helen, thank you so much. Oh, I'd love to, let me think about it. You know, and they'd call, I'd love to do this. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Well, this was sort of crazy. So I called Carol Gilligan, the women's psychologist who has studied the psychology of women, and I told her this story. I said, why are these women thanking me? And she said, Helen, women are disassociated. They don't know what they know. And how many of you have read Carol Gilligan's A Different Voice? And they don't know who they are. In the patriarchy, they're slammed by all this testosterone and masculinity in the culture, and they're split inside. And women can know things, but they don't know what they know. And women of wealth are powerful, but they don't know it. And you're inviting them to step into their power and heal their dissociation. And suddenly they feel like the person they really are, that they have power to change the world. And especially now, you're inviting them to unite and become a group and to step into their power. And they know now they can change the value system of the culture, their voice, they can unleash their voice, not just their money. It's about transforming the culture, that patriarchy, the vertical, into the horizontal.
So you mentioned your book, the Trailblazers book. You're writing that book about the historical significance of recent major female donors helped to catalyze the founding of Women Moving Millions. You've said you were raising funds as well as voices. Why did you take this approach?
Raising funds instead of voices.
Yeah, why did you take this approach of writing a book, telling stories about major donors?
Well, it's like I didn't have a voice growing up. And I was struggling. I had a very broken life in my 20s and 30s and 40s, and I couldn't find my voice. And I was struggling to find my voice, and I was beginning to find it working for Women's Philanthropy. But I thought, when we do this, and we ask women for money, for $1 million, why don't we tell them they can be in a history book? These are women making history, and you are making history. And we'll ask you, we'll have a page with a picture about the fact that you've made $1 million. First time in the history of the world women have ever funded women, big and bold. First time. And you're making history. So these women, like a big percentage of them were anonymous. They'd given money throughout the years, but they didn't want anyone to know. So we asked them 3 questions. I see heads nodding. Okay. We asked them to answer 3 questions. Why now? You've made a commitment, $1 million or more to women and girls. Why now? Why women? Why big and bold? So like I did at the beginning, I would ask these women to tell their story, and I wanted it succinct, just 2 or 3 paragraphs. They had to be succinct. And and then I had some people around me, and then they would try to help these women say it succinctly. And a lot of them, by the time, it sometimes took months to get their little answers exactly how they would go, I think this is why I'm doing it, but I'm not sure. Can we talk next week? And oh, I just realized it's this. And so anyway, it was like giving, each of these women came to voice as they were writing their page in the Trailblazer book. And a lot of these women, after they did this, said, I don't want to be anonymous anymore. Put my picture and my name there. So it was just a beautiful process that, oh, I didn't tell you I was going to say this. Do you think I have time?
Go ahead, okay. Please. We'd love to hear your stories.
So you know the Giving Pledge. Bill Gates, I'm sorry, Warren Buffett, Bill and Melinda. So one day I get a call from Melinda's office, and she goes, and the person calling says, look, we're doing the Giving Pledge. We've heard about Women Moving Millions. I said, yes. And she said, well, we understand all these women come to your meetings. And I said, yes. And so I told them about the Trailblazer book, that we're not just unleashing the women's pocketbooks, we're unleashing their stories. And they're able to talk. And in talking, one quote, well, I told Carol Gilligan I love this quote, and she said, I didn't say that, but I think she did. I think I heard Carol say once, voice without echo dies. And if you can have a thought and an opinion and a purpose, but if no one echoes you, it withers away. And Women Moving Millions became an echo chamber of women echoing each other's voices as they wanted to unleash their money, their voices and values and vision for the culture for the decades ahead and change the world.
It's so powerful because you were telling their stories and also helping them to understand their stories.
Yeah.
So you've also, in addition to that, in other books, you've written about the 1837 Antislavery Convention of American Women. Can you tell us about that convention and those women?
Yes. When I did go back to school for a while, after, as I was saying, I just sort of wanted to study the movement that I was trying to support, the women's rights feminist movement. I thought I was going to write a dissertation on faith and feminism. How are we doing on time?
Oh, we're good. We have plenty of time.
A book on, I was interested in faith and feminism, and at the core there was faith, like the Prishamat. But as I was going through the stacks of the different universities on the Northeast coast, I accidentally discovered a history of American women, a history of a convention of American women in 1837. So I thought there was a typo, and it was the Convention of Seneca Falls, because there were no other conventions of American women back then. And it said 1837, so I was really curious. And but it turns out there was a group of women that the ones I mentioned, that rose up in a time that women had no right to speak in public, and they felt called to speak out against slavery. And they created anti-slavery conventions, female anti-slavery conventions, because the men abolitionists wouldn't let the women join their conventions. It's so pitiful. So they started their own, and so they began to spread, and they decided to have a national convention. They were writing letters to each other. Well, they put on their little bonnets and they had their bustles and their shawls, and they got in their stagecoaches, or they got on steamboats or buggies, and they came to New York City for the first ever women's convention in the United States. And women weren't supposed to travel unescorted at that time. So they knew they were radical revolutionaries. So the diaries of these women at the time said, we're turning the world upside down. This convention is like, and they just were, you know, yay, us. And the first, they knew Robert's Rules of Orders, because women were very smart. And at that time, anyway, so the first proclamation that they'd worked on for weeks was that women have the right to speak in public. So that was what interested me. So I ended up doing my dissertation on this group of women whose history was lost to almost everybody, like no one's ever heard. And I said, goodness gracious, like once I finished the dissertation, I thought, Ken Burns had it wrong. Has anyone seen Elizabeth and Susan, his documentary on Seneca Falls? Oh, y'all haven't seen it? Well, Harville and I went back, and I had said, Harville, I want to see that Ken Burns documentary on Seneca Falls. It's Susan
B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, yes.
And throughout the documentary, it talks about the women's rights movement began in 1848 at Seneca Falls. And they have feminist historians quoted. And it's all about, this is the first time women had ever gathered to lift up their voices, so their voices would matter. And I was in tears at the end of this Ken Burns documentary, and I called Gloria Steinem the next day. I said, Gloria, Ken Burns, he got it wrong. And she said, well, Helen, Ken's history isn't always totally accurate, and he needs a new haircut. And your book is, all about it. So it was such an honor, number one, bringing these women out of the shadows of history and letting them stand tall, in my book anyway. But the thing that the book is about is that the earliest feminists in this country had an organizing methodology that was very different from the suffrage movement catalyzed by Susan and Elizabeth and the group of suffragettes. in the beginning, these women, feminist abolitionists, which historians now call them, the few that know about it, were organizing in a relational organizing methodology in a couple ways. So I'll share the couple ways. One, they petitioned. They couldn't vote and they couldn't speak in public, but they could circulate petitions for people to sign and send them to Congress. Smart. So they'd go door to door, and they'd go, "What is your name? You just introduced yourself. What is your name?" Kathy. Kathy, I'm so glad to meet you. I'm Helen, and I have a petition, and I'd like you to consider signing this. We think slavery should be abolished. It's not healthy for a country, and it's inhumane, obviously. And would you be willing to sign this petition? And sometimes the woman would go, "I'm not sure," or whatever, or "I'll sign," or "Well, can we come in and talk about it?" And in reading the records, they said some people didn't know slavery existed in the United States. Because this was rural New England. There was no TV, no radio, no cell phone. They didn't know slavery existed. But these women would go in and sit with other women, and it was so moving, you know. And then they got radicalized, and they became part of the feminist abolitionist movement. But they flooded Congress with petitions. Congress got so upset with all these letters that they passed the pick-me-gag rule in 1838 and refused to receive any more of the women's petitions. And they ended up taking them and burning them. They were so angry. But these women also, another thing they did that was so relational was called, a woman named Elizabeth Chandler created something called mental metempsychosis. The women regularly had weekly sewing groups, right? Imagine 1830, where Walmart isn't nearby. So they're fixing their clothes and that for their family. And those just existed. That's how women were. And Margaret said, okay, in all the slave sewing circles, there's a process I'm suggesting we use, which is called mental metempsychosis. And one of us will stand and read a slave narrative while the others are sewing. And while we hear that slave narrative, let's send our soul to our sisters in the South who are put on the auction block. And let's pretend for a moment we're on the auction block. And we're being sold to one plantation, our husbands sold to another plantation, and our children are being sold to that plantation. And let's experience for a moment what it's like for that woman when her family's just bought by other people. And let's develop sympathy for our sisters in the South. What is it like for them? And we got to do something to end slavery in this country. And she called it mental metempsychosis, and the women practice developing sympathy for their sisters. And this is something that today, if we learned how to practice sympathy and empathy for others, spend some time instead of combating each other and trying to win and compete, this is the kind of thing that could bring about the kind of relational culture that so many feminist sociologists have talked about trying to do.
And I know relational culture is really important to you, and that's something that you and your husband work on together. That's really one of the greatest joys of your life. Could you say a little bit more about that work and about safe conversations?
Oh, yeah. So I am just so blessed these days to be married to Harville Hendricks, who wrote a book published in 1988, and I didn't think anyone was going to buy it. Who's ever bought a book by a man named Harville? I mean, no. But I was a behind-the-scenes worker on the book, but 6 weeks after it came out, I picked up the phone, and we were living in New York, and it was the Oprah Winfrey studio. and she wanted him on the show. And she took his show and submitted to the Emmy committee, and it won Oprah her first Emmy. So she had him on 17 times. And so the book is, and she would always go, this is the best relationship expert in the world. So I get to be married to him. And we, the books, we have 60 languages, and he had the idea, which he often starts the sentences, but I help him finish it. He had the idea of getting this out of the clinic and into the public, because the relational sciences have gotten very easy to teach for the first time in history. It was a murky science for decades, but now you can teach it simply. And so we're doing something called Safe Conversations in Dallas, teaching people to shift from conflict to connection. You can disagree, mightily disagree. I would never have your opinion, but you can do it in a way that it doesn't rupture connection. And that's our specialty. We teach people how to talk. And so we're just sort of teaching people that technology, and it's spreading. And my joy is that all the women who have for years talked about wanting to create a more relational culture instead of a competitive, get to the top of the ladder, I win, you lose, who's the best, be the best. That kind of culture doesn't reflect who we really are. We're really relational creatures. And people want to be relational, but they don't have the technology. So we're getting that out. And we think of this as cutting edge feminism.
Wow, what a contribution. When one of the women who was practicing a sort of relational culture in the 1830s was Lucretia Mott, and you've written about her, and when everyone came in, people had the opportunity to see Lucretia Mott's shawl and bonnet, which are in our collection. I wonder if you could talk about what Mott means to you.
Knowing you would ask that question, I just one, my favorite quote of Lucretia's, she said, "Let us be the messiahs of our age." She was just whipped and beat up. You know, when they went to London, went across the ocean to go to the London World Abolition meeting. It was a 3-day meeting, and the women were there, and the first day they debated, should women even be allowed at the meeting? And the women had to sit in the balcony behind a curtain and listen the next 2 days, but they wouldn't let the women attend the meeting. Does anyone know that story? I mean, these women abolitionists were just so treated so horribly. And this frail little lady just would not give up. She was so delicate and gentle and soft-spoken, but she was a radical revolutionary. And she reminds me of Gloria Steinem, actually. And I actually wore today a bracelet that any of us can buy that friends of Gloria Steinem have made. And Gloria has been saying for the last 15 years that I've been around her, we need to be linked, not ranked, as a culture. Let's learn how to link together, not rank who's the best. We need to be linked, not ranked. And this bracelet says we need to be linked, not ranked. So it's a daily reminder. What are we doing to change the culture from that vertical patriarchy to the horizontal? And so, and I'm actually wearing 2 other things. I told Amanda, she went, oh my goodness. So a year ago, Bonnie Wheeler, a feminist scholar at SMU, gave me a Susan B. Anthony dollar to wear as jewelry. So Susan B. Anthony is here now, and the country fused women and money for a little while on this dollar. That's where it should be. We need more, any other money made women's on the dollars, right? And then I also wore an unlock it that the Women Moving Millions women created. Anyone who's part of the Women Moving Millions gets an unlock it when they become part of the community. And the point of Women Moving Millions is to unlock it. So that, like, some people are powerful by hoarding their money, and we think we're powerful by unleashing it and giving it away. And so we created for each of the women who become a part of Women Moving Millions. I mean, this is what these women did in becoming a community that the Giving Pledge, the billionaires didn't do. Like, we would have them come together, and they got, I don't even know if these are mint things, and they created little boxes, and their unlockets were given, you know, every time a woman would join. And they have little, I mean, I remember it was so cute when I would go to meetings and they're putting Red Hots around. This one says, "We have unlocked it." And that one says, "Unlock it." And so, you know, really, you know, who needs this much money? I mean, in the country, I mean, it's sort of, it's not right that some people are so wealthy, why some people are so struggling to get through life. And so we need to unlock this money to go into the world. And if before closing, I did want to mention Carol Gilligan.
Oh, sure, that'd be wonderful. Yeah, mention her, and I think we could open it up for questions. We'd love to hear the story.
Oh, so how many of you read David Brooks, the editorial New York Times editorial guy? Did you all read 2 weeks ago him writing about Carol Gilligan's new book, The Crisis of Connection, that she wrote with 2 other people? And this is a great book, and David Brooks said, this book, we need the women of this culture to heal the fact that this culture doesn't know how to be in relationship. We are a broken society. If we can't talk to each other respectfully, if we can't be a community, as Serena Connolly in Dallas, she goes, we need to be a community here. If we don't know how to do that, cities are never going to make it. This country is not going to make it if we can't be in relationship. He said everyone should read this book, and Carol is talking about the patriarchy is alive and well. We are still surrounded by a patriarchal energy in this culture that's all about competing and dominating and winning. And she is brilliant, echoing so much that Harville says, and Christy Carter says, who flew in from Dallas. Hi, Christy. This is healing the culture, learning how to talk together and be together in a different way.
Well, in the spirit of talking together, why don't we open it up for a few questions? Yes.
My name is Adrienne Arsht, and I've read a little about what you've done and are doing. The $1 million that a woman gives, is that done to your organization or directly to the charity of their choice?
That is a great question. So there were 2 phases of Women Moving Millions. The one that Swanee catalyzed, and then I helped her, with her vision. And we did that within the Women's Funding Network. Every woman who made $1 million or more, and some did 5 or 10, did it to their Women's Foundation. There was a struggle, and would Women Moving Millions live on since we had become such a we, and we did, and Jackie Zahner then took, and so we had a Women Moving Millions campaign. Could we raise 120 million? The Women's Funding Network had raised 850. Could we do the last 120 to take women's foundations crashing through the $1 billion mark? So that was our goal. As we did this campaign, from 2007 to 2009, there was an economic collapse. Do you remember that economic collapse? And that's when we were doing our fundraising campaign. And those campaigns didn't make it. And the London Times said, when they, after the next year, said that we were the only fundraising campaign that exceeded their goal. We raised $180 million during our campaign. Most of the campaigns didn't make it. And then when it became a community under Jackie Zehner, they opened it up, and it's giving to anything, $1 million or more, where women's voices and vision are expressed.
Sonia Michelle, thank you so much for your talk. I wonder if in your research on the 19th century, I'm sure you came across Dorothea Dix, and I wonder if you know about the memorials that she wrote when women couldn't be sitting in legislatures and couldn't even testify in legislatures. She would write these reports that were called memorials, and then she would prevail upon some male legislator to present them to the body. And she wrote a lot about, of course, her main focus was on reforming insane asylums. And so I would just wonder if you came across that method, that technique on the part of any other women in your research.
You mean the women writing and the men as a megaphone?
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
No, but that's really depressing.
But it was also very effective.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we now have 100 new women in Congress.
Yes.
To be speaking for themselves, but...
Yeah, can we applaud that? So yeah, she refused to be silenced, and she would do it in any way possible. And these women were so cunning. Oh my word, what they had to do to get their voice out. But I thank you so much for lifting up as her example and that population she cared so much about. And this is why we need to remember these women in history and how hard it was for them to do. That is so humiliating. I can't talk, but could you read? But that was a powerful strategy, wasn't it?
Amanda, do you have any of those in the collection? Do you know?
Of the memorials? I don't know. I would have to check. But yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I will look for that. Yeah.
Thank you for mentioning her. I love it when women in history who aren't here now are just named. And, there's so many women who suffered and died for our rights.
I want to add, I believe that she was able to get her bills through Congress to create the insane asylums and to get mentally ill people out of the jails and being chained up, and the president vetoed it.
Thank you, Swami. This is a special...
And then she died without ever seeing that veto overturned.
And this is a real important area for us in the Hunt family with mental issues that we've had in the family. And and as recently as 20 years ago, women in prison who were often there for reasons that it was a man, drug mule or whatever, if she was pregnant, she was shackled trying to give birth. And that had to get changed. Even there's so many problems still today.
I think maybe we have time for a final question. Yeah.
Hi, so thank you for the time. I'm actually researching for an article about giving circles. So I'm a reporter for the Chronicle of Philanthropy, so I'm interested in learning more about that. So I got some research that I'm working on now that's from the Collective Giving Research Group, and they did some work with the Women's Philanthropy Institute, and they sort of found that the interesting thing with giving circles is that even with the growth of so many of them, I think it was about 1,500 in the past 10 years, more of them are sort of serving sort of low income in different groups. So they're becoming more diverse. There's sort of that data behind it. So I was kind of interested in, because the Giving Pledge is a different version of a giving circle, but much larger. I'm wondering from your perspective about that sort of example being set for smaller giving circles. And I spoke to someone from the Dallas Women's Foundation, and they mentioned that too. So I was just curious from what you thought about giving circles.
May I ask who you spoke to?
Hallie Lee. I spoke to Hallie Lee and some other
Oh, Holly Lee.
Yes, Holly Lee, sorry, yeah.
Okay. Well, in a way, I think the Dallas Women's Foundation became like a giving circle, actually, that helped birth Women Moving Millions. And that was the last thing I was going to say, and I've been able to say everything, but thank you for that segue. Because women's giving circles are very important. A woman named Betty Regard gave the first million, and because of that, it was just such a wow. A woman named Sarah Losinger sort of validated this thing can probably make it. But the women who stepped out when no one else did, Cecilia Boone. Anyway, these women formed a very special giving circle in Dallas because we didn't know if it would work. And it was scary to ask women for $1 million. It was scary back then. But the power of a giving circle, we became each other's, their safety in numbers. And Sarah Losinger, when I went to her and said, is anyone going to do this? And she said, feminists are just flooded with, donors are flooded with requests and they're all good. And she said, what I think a woman would want to do is if their grandchild could look back and go, look what Granny did. I think maybe this would work. And a little circle surrounded Cecilia Boone and others. And the power of a giving circle, that little group in Dallas really catalyzed Women Moving Millions. Thank you for being here. Who was the person that said never underestimate the power of a small group to get something done?
Margaret Mead.
Oh, Margaret Mead, yeah. Never underestimate what might happen when a small group gets together in a giving way.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. I really want to thank you. Can we give Helen a round of applause? Thank you.